Well, now we're going to read this morning the first chapter of the book of Ruth, one of the great Old Testament narratives. My plan is over the next few weeks to do a little series looking at this wonderful book, the book of Ruth. So we're going to take chapter 1 this morning. So Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you, as you have shown kindness to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." At this they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Amen. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this wonderful story, account which we have in your word. And we realize that some of us perhaps have read this many, many times over many decades. But we ask this morning that as we approach this book, we may come humbly. We may desire above all that it will speak to us powerfully, those things which would help us to understand you and to see you more clearly and to live our lives more obediently before you. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. I think most Christians are very familiar with the book of Ruth, particularly the girls. It's a great story, and we all love great stories. And of course it has a great ending. Now stories are powerful things. They are. They connect powerfully with us. Stories touch us deeply. Jesus, of course, was a great and profound storyteller. One only has to think of the numerous parables that he told to be reminded of that. But it seems that often God uses stories to impress his truth upon us in a very particular way. Let me illustrate this to you this morning. For example, the Bible makes it very clear in the Ten Commandments that adultery is sin. And so you know that from reading the Ten Commandments. But then you read the story of David and Bathsheba. Harrowing tale of ultimately the dreadful consequences of the sin of adultery. It's both saying the same thing. But of course it's the story that impresses the truth upon us in a particularly powerful way. Similarly, you might say to your children, as indeed rightly so, lying is sinful and God doesn't want you to tell lies. But at the same time, you could also tell them the story of Ananias and Sapphira. The story powerfully showing the awful consequences of lying. Stories then become a very powerful way in which God communicates crucial messages to us. It's interesting when you look at the Old Testament, a lot of people, particularly folks who are not Christians, will say when it comes to the Old Testament, oh, it's all lists of names and laws and rules and regulations and all that kind of thing. Do you realize that somebody has calculated that 77% of the Old Testament is in story form, narrative form? The overwhelming emphasis in terms of the way in which God communicates his messages and his truth to us in the Old Testament is in the form of stories. Stories, it seems, are God's way of showing us as well that his truth is never something abstract and theoretical, simply to be observed, known about, maybe debated. But instead, I think stories remind us that God's truth is something that is to be lived out. It's to have a practical resonance and effect and consequence in the lives of boys and girls and men and women. It is to be applied, in other words, God's truth. There is a purpose behind the things which he reveals to us in his word which we are to know. So when we think, for example, about the character of God, we're not simply to be able to rattle off a series of theological statements about the Trinity, about God's communicable and incommunicable attributes, or whatever kind of grid and paradigm you would wish to put the doctrine of God in. The reality is what we know about God is actually to affect our living, our lives. And perhaps there's nowhere where we see that more clearly than how our lives function and how we function and respond as people when our lives hit difficulties and problems and adversities. So when we come to the book of Ruth, it is a story, but it is far more than that. Within the story and through the story, clear messages about God are being conveyed. And those messages are to have a resonance in our own lives. We read this story this morning thousands of years after it happened. We're not simply here going through the mechanics of looking at a bit of ancient history, how people lived in the days of the judges, what culture was like. That's very, very abstract. It might be interesting on one level, but the reality, it has little to do with you as you seek to bring up your children at the beginning of the 21st century, or work out what it means to live in your retirement in the 21st century here in Llanelli. The reality is that through this ancient story, we have God's truth. And we're to take and to respond practically and honestly to what God is saying to us through this message. So what is God's message in the book of Ruth? Now, Ruth actually, although it is a story, was not just written to make you smile or feel good by the time you get to the end. It does have a happy ending. And we like stories like that. We like films like that. Might not be particularly popular to like them, but the reality is I think we all do. We all like a happy ending, or at least when you hear a bit of news in someone's life, you're relieved to hear that everything's worked out okay. Now, the book of Ruth hasn't been written just so that you might read a story of how God worked in a few people's lives thousands of years ago, and in the end everything was okay, and so you kind of feel good about it. Instead, Ruth was written to convey powerfully a key, crucial message to your life about God. And for the generations since this incident first took place, that has been its function. Now, what is this key, crucial message about God? It is simply this, and it is profound, that whatever happens in life, God is always in complete control. Now, that is a foundational truth of the Christian life. It's the awareness that as you live your life, whatever is happening, no matter how dark it may be, no matter how chaotic it may appear, the news from heaven is this: God has not somehow lost control. It might look like that sometimes, and certainly it may feel like that. And in fact, I think as a Christian this morning, if you've never come to the kind of thought in your mind that somehow it looks as if God isn't interested, God doesn't care, God doesn't seem to understand, then the reality is you've not been a Christian for very long. We all have times in our lives as Christians when we may come to that kind of conclusion, if we might put that in inverted commas this morning. That what's happening in our lives, it appears as if God simply isn't in control. The book of Ruth challenges that, and it does it powerfully, and it does it in a very tender and helpful way. So the message of this book is that no matter what is happening, God is always completely in control. We began our service this morning by singing that great hymn, "Great is Thy Faithfulness." This book, the book of Ruth, is also about God's faithfulness to his people and his commitment to both love and save his people. Now, recently on Sunday evenings, not so long ago, I completed a series where we were looking at some of the big key movements in the Old Testament, but we were looking at them, if you like, with the emphasis on asking the question, where is Jesus in this? Where is grace in this? Where is gospel in this? And as we did this, we saw that all the main key movements in the Old Testament, ultimately the great issue is Jesus Christ. And we saw that you don't need to twist or bend Scripture to see this. Instead, we saw that all the great unfolding moments of the Old Testament have in view, above everything, the coming and the fulfillment of Jesus Christ. Now, here in this book as well, we're also going to see that not only God is in complete control, is its main message, but also we're going to see that the main character in the book of Ruth is actually Jesus Christ. Now, you might say, now, hang on a minute. I've been with you so far, but I've read Ruth enough times to know that the name Jesus isn't really mentioned in the book. So how can you say he's the main character? Well, I hope all will be revealed as we go along. So the great challenging thing we're going to be seeing in this very little brief series on this short 4-chapter book from the Old Testament is that God is always in control, making sure the salvation of his people is secure because he loves them. Now, before we jump in really here into chapter 1, I want to give you a little bit of necessary background. You see, there are certain things that are taken for granted when you come to this book. It's rather like if you go to watch a rugby match. It's taken for granted that you know the rules. So the game doesn't begin with like 20 minutes of some guy standing up and explaining what's about to happen and the rules. No, that's taken for granted. It's not just rugby, any sporting event. You watch the 100 metres at the World Athletics Championships going on in Russia at the moment. The guy doesn't stand up and say, well, now they've got these competitors, they're going to line up at one end, and when that gun goes, they're going to try and run as fast as they can and see who's the first to get to the end. They don't have to explain it. Why? It's a given that you already know. Now actually, when you come to Old Testament narratives, there are things like that going on. There are certain things that it's assumed you already know. But I wonder if you do know them. And so very briefly, let me remind you of them. What is being taken for granted here when you start the book of Ruth is a bit of history. That is, the way in which the world is and has been up to this point. What is taken for granted here is that, well, the world in which Ruth, Naomi, Orpah, and all the others live in is a world like ours, a world which God has made. And that when he made it, it was perfect. But it's a world that very rapidly fell into sin. And as a result of that, the world in which we live is the same world in which they live. It is a world now that is not perfect. And that's why in the opening chapters we read very early on about deaths and famine and sorrow. These things have come into our world because of the fall. And they have their root in sin. But what also we've been told, and is taken for granted as you come to the book of Ruth, is that God has made a promise. And the promise is that one day he will send someone to deal with the root cause of sin. And he's referred to in the Garden of Eden as one who will crush the head of the serpent being Satan. And so really what unfolds historically leading up to the book of Ruth is that all the time people are hoping that any day now coming into the world will be this one who will deal with the root cause of sin. And as time goes on, he is referred to not simply as the serpent crusher, but he's referred to as the Messiah. And the people to whom God referred to, this one who would one day come into the world and deal with the root cause of sin, who would be known as the Messiah, were his particular people, his covenant people. Now this bit is really important to the book of Ruth, okay? The world at the time in which Ruth is living is a world that is divided. Effectively, if we look at it through Bible eyes, is divided into two groups. There are God's people, Israel, and everybody else. The great distinguishing feature between these two groups is that Israel is God's people. And we know that because God made a very special, unique promise with them called a covenant. He made it through Abraham. And we'll be hearing a little bit about that later on this morning because it's very important to chapter 1. So what's been taken for granted here is that this is the world that God has made. It's a world that is fallen, and yet into it God has made a promise that one day he'll send a rescuer, a deliverer, and he's made that promise particularly to his special people Israel, who he gave this covenant promise to. Incidentally, it wasn't just a covenant promise that God gave. As time has gone on, he has begun to fulfill it. So, for example, he has given them a land. He has fulfilled that promise that he made. So there are these clearly established distinctions in the world. God's covenant people Israel, in a land of their own, waiting for the Messiah. Everybody else, outside of that promise, ignorant of the Messiah. Well, that's the background. Now let's come to the narrative. It begins with what can only best be described as the nightmare scenario. It begins with the nightmare scenario. In fact, the book of Ruth begins in a similar way to the story of Job, a description of a dreadful series of destructive events. The first 5 verses of Ruth 1 really show us this. In fact, there are 6 things that you can identify in those 5 verses which are brutal. The first is, in verse 1, we're told that all of this takes place in the days when the judges ruled. Now again, you need a little bit of background to understand that, but and when you do understand it, you realize that phrase, that it was a time when the judges were ruling. It's a bit like a kind of historical depth charge. It's like saying, you're living in Germany in the 1930s. Immediately your mind points in a certain direction and you understand things. There's a kind of political climate. And that's what we've been told here in verse 1. So what were the days when the judges ruled? Well, they were a time of spiritual crisis and decline. You can find out for yourself by reading the book of Judges. It's a dreadful book in some ways. There are numerous expressions of hope. Here's somebody who's going to come along and put everything right, but invariably they fall flat on their face. Interestingly, the book of Judges, if you ever notice, begins with God's people asking God what they should do. They're in a bit of a jam. We don't know what to do, so they cry out to him. By the time you get to the end of the book, we read that it was now a time when every man did what was right in his own eyes. So nobody even thinks about God anymore. So the time of the Judges is a time of very clear spiritual decline. And it's during that time of decline that this amazing story takes place. The second thing we read in verse 1 is that there was a famine in the land. Now, you don't need me to go into any detail about that, other than to say that a famine in Ruth's day and in Naomi's day really was a major crisis. It is a life and death situation. So famine in the land is a serious life and death situation. The third thing we see then, in terms of how this nightmare scenario begins to emerge, is that we read at the end of verse 1 that a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Now you say, what's so wrong about that? There's a famine in Judah, there's food in Moab. Surely the most sensible thing is just to go hop, skip and a jump over to Moab and live there and be safe. Well, the problem is this. By leaving Bethlehem and going to live in Moab, what are they doing? Let me take you back to the information which in many ways is assumed we already know. That covenant promise that God had made to Abraham when he made a particular people, Israel, included the promise of a land for themselves, the promised land. So leaving the promised land for a land where God is not known, where God is not worshipped, and where foreign gods hold sway, is really a dreadful thing to do. To walk out of the promised land, to seek refuge in a pagan land, is again a picture of profound spiritual decline. Now, fourthly, we see in verse 3, we're told that Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. And again, you don't need me to tell you just how grim that must have been for Naomi. She's now in a foreign country, cut off from everything that's familiar, without a husband. But she has been left with her 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And in verse 4, we're told they marry Moabite women. And you might say, great, bit of security in her life. No, not according to the law of God. To marry women, not just of another culture, but women who are part of a system who worship false gods, is a grievous thing in the eyes of the Lord. And so we read in verse 5, finally, the nightmare scenario is complete when we read that both Mahlon and Chilion died. And so Naomi is now left in a foreign country without her 2 sons and her husband. So the picture which emerges in the opening verses of chapter 1 is a very bleak one. It is very grim. There is a lot of suffering here. There is a lot of pain here, and a lot of sadness, and a lot of confusion. Living in days of spiritual rebellion, physical and economic hardships as a result of famine. They've walked out of the promised land. They've preferred to go and live with pagans, and all the men in the story are dead. And in the end, she's left alone, Naomi that is, in a pagan world. Now, this is real suffering. This is why later on in verses 20 and 21, when she does go back to Bethlehem, everyone comes out. They're delighted to see her because it's been quite a while since they were there. And the women of the town say at the end of verse 19, "Can this be Naomi?" They're not quite sure. She's changed a bit maybe. And certainly suffering does that to people. Her response in verse 20 and verse 21 is very direct. "Don't call me Naomi." Why? Well, as you know, names have meanings, and the name Naomi means pleasant. So he said, "Don't give me that name anymore. Call me Mara." Now, Mara means bitterness. And the conclusion is that you must call me no longer Naomi, that is pleasant, call me Mara, bitter instead, because the Lord has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Now, I think uppermost in Naomi's mind is, of course, the tragedy of losing a husband and her 2 sons. That is a profound tragedy. Profound suffering in her life. But as we read this book, and as we read it in the way in which God invites us to read it, we realize that there is more to this tragedy than just this. There is the personal tragedy of the loss of her husband and her sons, but there is also a wider, deeper spiritual tragedy. Remember the context for this book? It is a fallen world like ours. But a promise has been made by God that one day there will come from a woman one who will deal with the problem of sin. And so there was a sense where those who understood that and were eager for it. And so every time a child was born, a little boy was born, the thought was, is this the one? Is this the Messiah? Is this the serpent crusher? But as we read the book of Ruth and in the opening verses, all the men are dead. And as Naomi makes it abundantly clear, there is no prospect of children emerging in this narrative at all. And so there's a sense where if you were somebody in Ruth's day and you're waiting and hoping for the Messiah, and somebody says, "Let me tell you about the story of Ruth," you go a few verses and you realize what was happening. There's a sense where you could be forgiven for kind of interrupting and saying, "Well, I'm sure it's a very interesting story, but it's not what I'm really looking for, because I'm really looking for and hoping and waiting for the Messiah." So this story, as it begins, presents to us a picture which is as bleak can be. On the human level, the tragedy of a loss of a husband and 2 sons. And spiritually, it appears, the prospect of no Messiah. Now, I found this very challenging as I've been thinking about this. It reminds me that when life's problems come our way, we must be careful to realize and to ask the question, well, where are the real tragedies? Where are the real tragedies? Sure, there is tragedy in loss of, as Naomi experienced here, loss of life. But there are spiritual tragedies as well. This came home to me many years ago. I remember a friend of mine who's a minister better not say where, but he was in a Christian bookshop, and it wasn't long after the exam results were coming out, which of course we'll be doing in a few weeks now. The O-levels, I think they were then, rather than GCSEs. And of course there's a lot of expectation amongst the children who've sat those exams, rightly so, and the parents, of course. And everybody hopes that they've done well. Now, earlier on in that summer, a group of young people had gone away to a Christian camp. And while they'd been on that camp, some of them had become Christians, but not all of them. And this, of course, was a great source of joy about those who'd become Christians, but a great concern still about those who still hadn't responded to the gospel. That had taken place a few weeks previously. Well, this minister happened to be in this Christian bookshop on the day of the exam results. And the exam results came out. And he saw a group of women, and there, of course, was quite a mixture amongst them. Some were absolutely thrilled and delighted that their little boy or teenage daughter or son had done well. But there was one woman who was heartbroken because her son hadn't done as well and was expected. Bitterly, bitterly disappointed. And I remember him talking to me and saying how challenged he was that this woman whose son hadn't done so well in his exams was also one of the young people who had resisted the gospel and had not responded to the offer of God's love in Jesus Christ. And he said to me, it came home to me, we can weep over failed exams and fail to weep over the rejection of salvation. As times like that, you kind of see the world a bit like that when you're a pastor. And it's times like that, it comes home to you in that way. And it's made me think when I look at the book of Ruth, there's the human tragedy of the loss of a husband and the loss of two sons, which is dreadful. And failing exams is dreadful. We understand that. We're not minimizing that. But there's a deeper tragedy potentially here in the book of Ruth. And it's the tragedy of no Messiah. And I think about my own life, and maybe you think about yours. And you find yourself wondering, as perhaps I found myself wondering, do I have the right perspectives? Are the things I get upset about the things ultimately in God's eyes are worth getting upset about? Are the things that I get really delighted by, are they really ultimately the things that delight God? But of course the big thing in Ruth 1 isn't perhaps that. The big thing is this, and it is really practical to every single one of us. What do you do when your life hits a nightmare scenario? I mean, that's really what the book of Ruth is about. It begins with this scenario, real crisis, crisis after crisis after crisis. How do you respond? How do you respond when you suddenly hear there's something wrong with you? You've had a diagnosis from the doctor, or maybe a loved one has. Or you've lost your job, or there's serious difficulties in your job or in relationships or whatever it is. How do you respond? What do you do? Where do you look for your help and comfort? You know, sadly, there are some Christians whose faith comes almost totally unstuck when their life hits a crisis. I think there's a sense where you can see this happening to Naomi in this. She speaks very clearly, at least in her mind, that God is out to get her. That's how she kind of describes it, isn't it? Look there at verse 20 and 21 when she goes back to Bethlehem, verses we read a few moments ago. Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Why? Because the Almighty's made my life very bitter. I went out full. You know, everything was great. But the Lord has brought me back empty. And then she says at the end of verse 21, the Lord has afflicted me. The Lord, the Almighty, has brought misfortune upon me. Her sense is that there is no sense of God's goodness now in her life at all. And there are some Christians like that. They hit a crisis, a difficulty. And as a result of failing to understand and to think things through biblically in the way in which God invites us to, their lives very rapidly come unstuck. Sadly, I've known many people over the years who've been in this situation. Everything is fine between them and God, so long as life is fine. But the minute life takes a twist or a turn, then things between them and God, immediately there are problems. I think sometimes they fail to recognize that Christians are not immune from crises. There's a day when that will happen, but that day is when we'll be in heaven. As we live in this life, we're all caught up in the effects of the fall. Christians get sick, the same as anybody else. Christians experience accidents and disasters, the same as everybody else. The Bible has much to say about suffering, and what it says is very important. But what we've been shown in this book is that even the worst crisis is never beyond God's perfect control. And within his control, his great concern is to love and save his people. Now, I'll give you the first 5 verses of this book as you read it. It doesn't look as if God's in control, does it? It doesn't. It looks like a complete disaster. Famine, death, destruction. It looks as if God somehow has stepped away and that he is absent. But as we work our way through these chapters, we'll see that God is very busy and active all of the time. And the thing that we're invited to see as Christians when our lives are in crisis is, of course, the very message of this book, that no matter how the situation may appear, God is in control. This is the great anchor of hope in the storms of life. God never promises to make everything all right for his people all of the time. Not every Christian life rides off comfortably into the setting sunset, peacefully. There are many Christian lives that may even end in great difficulty and great trauma. But within it all, the Christian has an anchor in the storms of life. And the anchor is this: the Lord is in control and he knows what he's doing. And I think the great challenge that you and I face when our lives are in crisis is, do we really trust what God is doing? Do we really trust God to be doing what is really best? You know, when someone's life hits a difficulty, if there's one verse that gets quoted, probably more than any other verse, it's Romans 8:28. For we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purposes. Now, that verse is very helpful, but it can also be abused. God works for the good. Well, it means in the end everything's going to be all right, doesn't it? But that simply isn't the case. That's why in our world in the 20th century there have been more Christian martyrs in the 20th century than all the other centuries put together. You simply can't say to the family of a Christian who's been executed for their faith, all things work together for good, and leave it at that. And thankfully, that's not what the Apostle Paul said in Romans 8:28. He put it in a very particular context, and the context of this: God works for the good of those who love him. What does that mean? Does that mean that in Christians' lives, ultimately there should be no suffering, there should be no success, there should be no difficulties, there should only be instead success and happiness? The answer to what is meant by the good of those who love him is in the next verse. And the next verse simply says this: for those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the likeness of his Son. Now, what does that mean? It means this: that in a life of trauma, we can always be certain that God is working in the traumatized, that through the experience, they will become more and more like Jesus Christ. Now that is very different from the notion that somehow in the end everything works out all right because you're a Christian. What the Bible actually tells us is that in every crisis you can be guaranteed that God will work in you to cause you to be more like his Son. You see, God has a particular agenda for you in your crisis. It's to refine you and to purify you and to strengthen you and to lead you into greater Christ-likeness. Maybe you need to learn more patience. Maybe I do. Maybe we need to learn more perseverance or humility. Crisis is often the way we learn these and other Christ-like qualities. And of course, they're painful lessons, but they're necessary. And if we don't have that spiritual perspective on life, it will make these crises all the more painful. And so the opening part of the book of Ruth begins in a nightmare. It begins in a dreadful series of events. But this book has been given to show us that even in the darkness, always in the darkness, God is in control. And interestingly, Naomi's assessment of her life, God is out to get me, don't call me pleasant anymore, call me bitter, we're going to see over the next few weeks is about as far from the reality as you could imagine. And I think that's wonderfully comforting, isn't it? For when God works, ultimately his desire is to do us good and to do good things in us as he causes us to be more and more like his Son, Jesus Christ. We're going to sing a great hymn to close this morning, and it's the hymn "Through All the Changing Scenes of Life, in Trouble and in Joy, the praises of my God shall still my heart and tongue employ." We'll stand to sing as we close our service this morning.